I've been a bartender for over a decade now. I've seen it all. Drunken brawls, tearful confessions, and even a few half-sober marriage proposals. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened last night. It started like any other shift, but by the time the clock struck midnight, I was questioning everything I thought I knew about this world, and whatever waits beyond it. The bar is a relic of a bygone era, a place where time seems to stand still. It sits on the edge of town, where the streetlights flicker like dying fireflies and the pavement cracks like dried bones. The sign above the door read, "The Dusty Trail," used to glow bright red, but now it's faded, and the letter D had long since burned out, leaving only a ghostly faint outline. The building itself is unremarkable. Brick walls weathered by decades of neglect, windows clouded with grime, and a door that groans on its hinges like a tired old man. It's the kind of place that feels forgotten, like it's holding its breath, waiting for something. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of spilled beer, cigarette smoke, and something else, something faintly metallic, like the tang of blood. The walls were adorned with faded photographs of patrons long forgotten, their faces frozen in time, their laughter silenced. A jukebox in the corner played a melancholic tune, the kind that made you feel like the world was ending even if it wasn't. The song was scratchy, the record skipping occasionally, but no one ever bothered to fix it. It was part of the bar's charm, or so I told myself. Though it's not the rainy season, the rain fell relentlessly last night. It hammered against the pavement like hurried footsteps, a constant rhythm that hadn't let up for hours. The windows were rain-streaked, casting eerie shadows inside. The streets outside were dark, glistening rivers beneath the flickering streetlights. Thunder rumbled low in the distance, a growl that rolled through the sky like a warning. The storm felt restless, like it wasn't just rain and wind out there, like something unseen was moving through it, waiting for the right moment to step inside. I stood behind the bar, wiping down the counter, already counting the minutes until closing. It was a slow night, just a couple of regulars in the corner, their heads bowed over their drinks. The regulars were familiar faces. Old Steve, who always ordered the same thing, a pint of cheap lager, and Charles, who nursed a glass of red wine while scribbling in his notebook. They didn't talk much, but their presence was comforting in a way. They were part of the rhythm of the place, like the ticking of a clock. And then, just as I was all done with my job, the front door creaked open. I froze. The sound was slow, deliberate, like the door itself was hesitating. My eyes snapped to the entrance, and for a moment, I thought it was just the wind. But then I saw it, a shadow, darker than the night outside, slipping through the doorway. The air grew heavy, cold, like the temperature had dropped in an instant. My breath caught in my throat as a stranger stepped in, dripping from the storm outside. He was tall and gaunt, his skin stretched too tight over his cheekbones. An old-fashioned long coat clung to him, like something pulled from a black and white photograph. He carried no umbrella, nor did he bother to shake the rain from his shoulders. Instead, he simply stood there, motionless, scanning the room with eyes hidden beneath the shadowed brim of a dark hat. He walked toward the far end of the bar and sat alone next to the window, his boots making no sound against the wooden floor. He was staring outside the window. I went to attain him and asked, "What would you like to have, sir?" Silence. Deep silence. There was no answer. It seemed strange to me, and I asked again, "What do you want, sir?" Still no answer, I again asked. Finally he spoke. His voice was barely above a whisper. "Whiskey, neat," he said. I nodded and poured, trying to ignore the unease prickling at the back of my neck. As I slid the glass toward him, he reached for it with long, bony fingers. I tried to ignore him, focusing instead on the task at hand, wiping down the counter, rearranging the bottles, anything to keep my hands busy. But I could feel his eyes on me, watching, waiting. It made my skin crawl, though I couldn't say why. There was something about him, something off, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. The jukebox skipped, the song stuttering before resuming its mournful melody. I glanced at the clock above the bar, 10:47 p.m. Still early, but the night felt endless, like it was stretching out before me, dark and infinite. His hands were clasped around the glass of whiskey I'd poured for him 10 minutes ago. He hadn't taken a sip. Instead, he just stared at it, his fingers slowly tracing the rim in deliberate, endless circles. "Is everything all right?" I asked the man, trying to sound casual, though my voice came out tighter than I intended. He didn't look up. He said, "Just thinking," his voice low and gravelly, like the sound of distant thunder. I nodded and left him to his thoughts, but the unease lingered. The bar felt different tonight, heavier, quieter, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. The shadows seemed darker, the corners deeper, and the air was thick with a tension I couldn't explain. I poured myself a glass of water, my hands trembling slightly as I lifted it to my lips. But I could feel his eyes on me, heavy and unrelenting, like a weight pressing down on my shoulders. I tried to ignore him, to focus on the task at hand, but the silence was unbearable, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. Something bad, very bad. The regulars left shortly after, their chairs scraping against the floor as they stood. Steve tipped a couple of dollars to me on his way out, and Charles gave me a small smile. But neither of them said a word. The door creaked open and then slammed shut behind them, leaving me alone with the stranger. The music got stopped. The silence was deafening, broken only by the hum of the neon sign outside and the occasional clink of glass as I rearranged the bottles behind the bar. I glanced at the stranger again. He still hadn't taken a sip of his drink. The glass of whiskey sat in front of him, untouched, the amber liquid catching the dim light and casting faint ripples on the table. I wiped down the counter again, though it was already spotless. The rag in my hand smelled of bleach and stale beer, and the scent made my stomach churn. I needed to get out of here, to breathe fresh air, to clear my head. But I couldn't leave. Not yet, not while he was still here. The clock ticked on loudly, each second dragging by like an eternity. The jukebox started again and played its mournful tune, the notes echoing in the empty bar. And all the while, the stranger sat in silence, his presence a dark cloud hanging over the room. I didn't know it then, but the night was far from over. The quiet beginning was just that, a beginning, and what came next would change everything. But for now, I wiped down the counter, poured another drink, and waited. Because that's what I did. That's all I could do, until the stranger decided to speak. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I stopped wiping and looked up, meeting his gaze. His eyes were dark, almost black, and they seemed to go on forever, like two bottomless pits. There was something unsettling about them, something that made my skin crawl. "Do you have any problem? Is everything all right?" I asked, my voice breaking the silence like a crack in glass. I tried to sound casual, but it came out strained, tight. He didn't answer right away. He just stared at me, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table, his fingers still tracing the rim of his glass. "You believe in ghosts?" he asked. The question caught me off guard. I blinked, unsure if I'd heard him correctly. "What?" "Ghosts," he repeated, his tone flat, matter of fact. "Do you believe in them?" I laughed, though the sound felt forced even to my own ears. "Can't say I do. I've seen enough weird stuff in this job to last a lifetime. But ghosts? Nah." He didn't laugh. He didn't even smile. He just kept staring at me, his dark eyes boring into mine. "You will," he said simply. He slowly rose to his feet, his movements unnervingly stiff, and began walking toward me. As he drew closer, a cold dread coiled its way down my spine, but I tried to brush it off. "What makes you say that?" I asked. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a photograph. It was old, the edges frayed and the image faded, as if it had been handled too many times. He slid it across the counter toward me, his movements slow and deliberate. I hesitated and then picked it up. The moment I saw it, my blood ran cold. It was a picture of this bar, taken decades ago based on the style of the decor. The walls were the same, the counter, the stools, even the jukebox in the corner. But it was the bartender in the photo that made my heart stop. He stood behind the counter, a glass in his hand, his face turned slightly toward the camera. And that face, it was mine. Every detail was identical. The scar above my eyebrow, the way I held my head slightly tilted to the side, even the faint shadow of stubble on my jaw. It was me, but it couldn't be. The photo was old, older than I was. I stared at it, my hands trembling, my mind racing. "That's impossible," I whispered, my voice barely audible. The jukebox stops. "Is it?" "Look closer," the stranger asked, his tone calm, almost mocking. I did, and my stomach churned. The bartender in the photo wasn't just someone who looked like me. It was me. There was no doubt about it. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut, and I felt the room spin around me. "How?" I stammered, my voice shaking. "This is some kind of trick. Who put you up to this? Was it Daniel? That prick's always trying to mess with me." The stranger shook his head slowly and said, "No trick. You've been here before. You just don't remember." I dropped the photo as if it had burned me, and it fluttered to the counter, face up. I backed away, my heart pounding, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. "This isn't real. This can't be real," I yelped. The stranger leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving mine. "It's real, and you're not the only one. Everyone who works here, everyone who stays too long, they're all like you. Trapped," he answered. "Trapped?" I echoed, my voice barely a whisper. He nodded. "This bar, it's not just a bar. It's a way station, a place for souls who are not ready to move on." I shook my head, trying to clear the fog that had settled over my mind. "No, no, that's crazy. I'm not dead," I cried. The stranger didn't respond. He just stared at me, his dark eyes filled with something I couldn't quite place. Pity, maybe, or regret. He said, "Think about it. Have you ever left this place? Really left? Or do you just go home at night and come back the next day, over and over, like you're stuck in a loop?" I felt the room closing in around me, the walls pressing closer, the air growing heavier. I needed to get out of here, to breathe, to think. But I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, my mind racing, and my heart pounding in my chest. The stranger stood, his chair scraping against the floor. "You'll see, soon enough. You'll see," he said, his voice low and ominous. And with that, he turned and walked toward the door, his coat billowing behind him like a shadow. The door creaked open, and then he was gone, leaving me alone in the silent bar, the photograph still lying on the counter, staring up at me like an accusation. I couldn't bring myself to touch it again, but I couldn't look away either. The face in the photo, my face, haunted me, its eyes seeming to follow me no matter where I moved. I picked it up again, my hands trembling, and stared at the face in the photo. My face, the face of a man who had been here before, who had lived and died and somehow ended up here, trapped in this place, this purgatory. I paced behind the bar, my mind racing. The stranger's words echoed in my head over and over like a broken record. "You've been here before. You just don't remember." It was impossible. It had to be. And yet, the photo was real. I couldn't explain it, couldn't rationalize it away. It was there, staring me in the face, demanding answers I didn't have. The jukebox started playing again, the mournful tune filling the air, and I felt the weight of the stranger's words settle over me like a shroud. I poured myself a drink, my hands trembling so badly that I spilled whiskey all over the counter. I didn't care. I needed something to steady my nerves, to quiet the storm in my mind. I downed the drink in one gulp, the burn of the alcohol doing little to calm me. The stranger's story was just the first thread in a web that would unravel everything I thought I knew about myself, about this bar, about the world. And there was no going back. By that time, it seemed the rain was not going to stop. The jukebox had fallen silent once again, leaving the bar in an eerie silence. The neon sign outside flickered, casting strange, shifting shadows on the walls. I felt like I was being watched, though I knew I was alone. Or at least, I thought I was. I glanced at the clock. 11:23 p.m. The night stretched on, endless and oppressive. I picked up the photograph again, my hands still shaking. The bartender in the photo, me, looked so real, so alive. But the photo was old, decades old. How could it be me? How could any of this be real? I whispered myself. I thought back to what the stranger had said. This bar. It's not just a bar. It's a way station, a place for souls who are not ready to move on. Was that what this was? A place for the dead who didn't know they were dead? I shook my head, trying to dispel the thought. It was ridiculous. I was alive. I could feel my heart beating, my lungs filling with air. I could feel the cold sweat on my skin, the ache in my feet from standing too long. I was alive. I had to be. But then why couldn't I remember the last time I left this bar? Why couldn't I remember anything beyond the routine of my shifts, the faces of the regulars, the smell of bleach and stale beer? My memories felt thin, like a veil that could be torn away at any moment. I poured another drink, but this time I didn't drink it. I just stared at the liquid, my reflection distorted in the amber surface. The stranger's voice echoed in my mind again. Think about it. Have you ever left this place? Really left? Or do you just go home at night and come back the next day, over and over, like you're stuck in a loop? I tried to think, to remember, but my mind was a fog, a haze of half-formed memories and fleeting images. I couldn't remember my childhood, my family, my friends. I couldn't remember anything beyond the bar, beyond the endless cycle of pouring drinks and wiping counters. Panic rose in my chest, tight and suffocating. I needed answers. I needed to know the truth. But how? The stranger was gone, and I had no one else to turn to. No one except I looked around the bar, my eyes scanning the faded photographs on the walls. The faces of patrons long forgotten, their smiles frozen in time. Were they like me? Were they trapped here too? Their souls bound to this place, unable to move on? I walked over to the nearest photograph, my footsteps echoing in the silence. It was a group shot taken decades ago. The people in the photo were laughing, their glasses raised in a toast. But as I looked closer, I noticed something strange. Their eyes were hollow, empty, like the eyes of the stranger. I stumbled back, my heart pounding. This couldn't be real. It couldn't be. But the evidence was right in front of me, undeniable and terrifying. The lights flickered, and the bar was plunged into darkness. I fumbled for the flashlight I kept under the counter, my hands shaking so badly that I dropped it twice before I finally got a grip on it. When I turned it on, the beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the bar in stark relief. And then I saw them. Shadows moved in the corners of the room, shifting and writhing like living things. They began to take shape, forming figures that looked almost human but weren't quite right. Their eyes glowed faintly in the dark, and their mouths stretched into grotesque smiles. "Welcome back," one of them hissed, its voice like nails on a chalkboard. I backed away, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The shadows closed in, their laughter echoing in my ears. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The stranger's voice echoed in my mind. "You've been here before, you just don't remember." And then it all came flooding back. The endless cycle of serving drinks to people who weren't really there. I had died years ago, but I hadn't moved on. I was stuck here, trapped in this purgatory of my own making. The shadows reached for me, their cold fingers brushing against my skin. I closed my eyes, waiting for the end, but it didn't come. When I opened my eyes, I was back behind the bar, the counter clean and the lights bright. The jukebox was playing. Everything was back to normal, or so I thought. I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the mirror behind the bar. My face was pale, my eyes hollow. And behind me, in the shadows, I saw them, the other lost souls, waiting for their turn to be remembered. I don't remember much after that. Just flashes, flickering lights, the smell of something that I doesn't know, and a voice that wasn't a voice, whispering things I couldn't understand. The door was closed, the rain had ceased, and the bar lay in an eerie silence, broken only by the faint murmur of the jukebox. I searched for the photograph but found nowhere, but something was different. The air still felt heavy, like the shadow hadn't really left. And when I looked at the clock, it was stuck at midnight. I don't know what came into my bar last night, but I know it wasn't human. And I know it's not gone. I can feel it, even now, watching me from the corners of the room, waiting for the right moment to step back inside.